Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover the effects of range of motion on muscle hypertrophy. First and foremost, let's establish what exactly we mean when referring to range of motion. In a general sense, range of motion refers to how far a joint is moved in a certain direction. However, range of motion becomes a bit more nuanced when we talk about it in the context of resistance training for hypertrophy. Let's now explore the different definitions of range of motion and how they are relevant to hypertrophy training. The first form of range of motion is joint range. Like we mentioned, this refers to how far a joint is moved in a given direction. This is the most common definition of range of motion and the most quantifiable because it can be measured as a joint angle. However, this is not really useful for hypertrophy training because we aren't concerned with the joint range, we're concerned with the range of the target muscle. The second form of range of motion is that of the exercise. We can define range of motion based on the exercise being performed. For example, we can say that a full range of motion bench press is that which touches the chest in the bottom position and has complete elbow extension in the top position. This classification can be used when describing the specifics of an exercise. And the last form of range of motion is muscle range. This refers to the degree of muscle lengthening and contracting throughout an exercise. This is the most relevant and important consideration for hypertrophy training because ultimately we are trying to train the muscle itself while the exercise is just a method to do so. We should understand that different exercises may take a muscle through different ranges of motion, even if both exercises use a full range of motion. For example, a chest fly takes the chest through a greater range of motion than a bench press, even if both exercises are performed with full range of motion. So what influence does range of motion have on muscle hypertrophy? Well, it is quite clear from the scientific literature that greater range of motion generally results in greater muscle growth. This systematic review analyzed the effects of range of motion on muscle growth. The authors concluded that training through a larger range of motion was superior for hypertrophy in the lower body, but there was conflicting evidence for the arms. There were only 2 studies that tested partial versus full range of motion for the arms. One found superior hypertrophy using full range of motion, and the other found superior hypertrophy using partial range. All other studies in this review found either superior or equal growth using full range of motion. So it seems that larger range of motion generally results in greater growth, although there was some slightly conflicting evidence for this. However, we also have some other mechanistic reasons that full range of motion may be superior. Let's now look at some potential mechanisms that may explain why larger range of motion may be superior for muscle growth. First is that a longer range of motion involves more mechanical work to be performed by the muscle. So each repetition requires more total force to be produced across the entire range of motion compared with partial range. Furthermore, muscle activation may differ at different portions throughout the range of motion. For example, this study found that activation of the lower body muscles changed at different portions of the squat exercise. So if we only train with partial range of motion, we may only be maximally stressing a small portion of the fibers rather than all of them. The second potential mechanism is the length of the muscle during resistance training. This refers to how lengthened a muscle is during the resistance loading. It seems that stressing a muscle at long lengths appears to result in greater muscle hypertrophy than training at shorter lengths. This study found that training the hamstrings using the seated leg curl resulted in greater hypertrophy than the lying leg curl. Because the seated leg curl places the hamstrings in a longer position, it suggests that training at longer muscle lengths may be more hypertrophic. Furthermore, this study found that gastrocnemius activation was greater during the standing calf raise compared with a seated calf raise. This suggests that activity may be greater when a muscle is trained at longer lengths. Relating back to range of motion, when we train with greater range, we are providing stress at longer muscle lengths, which may be more hypertrophic. Another potential mechanism that may result in greater growth from larger range of motion is stretch under load. This is related to the previous point, although here we are referring to active contraction under load when the muscle is in a stretched position. This is a difficult variable to isolate, but we have indirect evidence that it may be somewhat hypertrophic. This study found that static stretching between sets of resistance training produced superior hypertrophy than the same training program without stretching. While this isn't really stretch under load, it still provides some evidence that stretch between muscle contractions may be somewhat hypertrophic. The authors also made note that this isn't enough evidence to confidently conclude this idea, and more research is needed to support this theory. When we train with full range of motion, we are getting a stretch on the muscle between and during active contraction, which is another potential mechanism that may result in greater growth. And the last potential mechanism that may be responsible for greater hypertrophy using larger range of motion is muscle damage. It seems that training at greater ranges of motion results in more muscle damage, which may therefore induce greater hypertrophy. This study compared isometric biceps training at a greater versus smaller elbow angle. It was found that training with the larger joint angle, or in other words when the biceps were at a longer length, resulted in longer recovery time for strength, more muscle soreness, and greater muscle tenderness. While these aren't direct measures of hypertrophy, they indicate that training a muscle at longer lengths seems to result in more muscle damage. So what practical conclusions can we take away from these findings? Well, first and foremost, trainees should always use full range of motion with the exercises they perform, unless they experience joint pain with that particular range. It is clear that training through a larger range of motion almost always results in greater muscle growth compared with partial range. These findings also have implications for exercise selection. Because the exercise range of motion is not the same as muscle range of motion, we want to preferentially include exercises which take the muscle through a large range. For example, we may want to include exercises like chest flies and stiff leg deadlifts in our training program, which take the muscle through a large range of motion and provide a high stretch under load. And the last consideration is lifting technique. Trainees should use a technique that maximizes tension on the target muscle throughout the entire range of motion. Because tension at long muscle lengths seems to be highly hypertrophic, trainees should control the lift throughout the entire range to maximize dynamic muscle contraction and minimize involvement of the elastic stretch shortening cycle. This will ensure the muscle is actively challenged at long lengths and will likely experience a more significant hypertrophic stimulus. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.